We're now live on YouTube. This is the November 5th, 2018 meeting of the Joint Foundation Bootstrap Committee. We're joined by 9 different individuals participating from across the Node.js project as well as the JS Foundation. We have a pretty full agenda today. We've got a couple issues and, let's jump right into it. So the first thing that we have on the agenda is a 5-minute time box item. It's issue number 19, doc initial governance. This is a pull request of mine to outline some initial governance ideas and how we can kind of get started with stuff. Kicking off the timer. So we have a handful of sign-offs on this. The biggest thing in here, we talked about it in the last meeting, we may be even able to just join it to land it. Rather than landing it immediately as a governance doc, I have it in here as a stage 0 proposal. We'll get into talking about the stage proposal system a little bit later in the meeting. This outlines, the Bootstrap team, that the proposals and that it's a proposal that's in progress. It defines what a member is. It defines who are team members. It lists the @Node.js/members, the JSF project maintainers, the JSF TAC, the Node.js Foundation Board of Directors, and the JSF Board of Directors as members who can participate in the group. It outlines that there's team meetings that are weekly and that there's a designated moderator approved by the team to run meetings. It's worth mentioning that, I've kind of just stepped up to be moderating these meetings. I'm more than happy and potentially slightly enthused to share these, this. So, anyone else wants to step up and help with it, please do. It specifies that items are added to the agenda using the agenda tag. This is how we've been doing it up till now and how we do it for other projects within the Node.js Foundation. And that any community member or contributor can ask for something to be added to the next meeting's agenda by logging a GitHub issue. It says that prior to each of the meeting, the moderator will share the agenda with members of the team, and the team members can add any item they like to the agenda at the beginning of each meeting. The moderator and the team cannot veto or remove items. The moderator is responsible for summarizing the discussion. It has a high-level overview of the consensus-seeking process that we run by. It also has some rules around merging PRs, specifically that it does not apply to the Node.js core repository, only to the Bootstrap repository, and the pull requests must have no objections and have been open for at least 72 hours in order to be merged into this repository. A pull request unable to reach consensus cannot be merged. And then at the bottom, it has the developer's certificate of origin. Does anyone have any questions about the document and where it's at right now? I see no hands. Does anyone object to landing this right now as a stage 0 proposal, which will be the lowest level of proposal in whatever staging process we have? Tierney, you have your hand up?
If it's landed as a stage 0 proposal, can it be changed still once after that?
Yes, like during this meeting?
I just wanted to, I agree with what Matteo said at the bottom of his review around moving the DCO out of this into contributing or somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to be sure that if it's merged, that it won't be like a harder process.
I think it should be easier in that you could submit a PR to do that if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, also for what it's worth,
You just did.
I just did it.
I figured he was doing it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
No problem.
But I think any of these, whatever stage they're at, they're still subject to people PRing and changes and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and we'll get into the staging stuff very soon, and you'll see there's granularity in the staging process around this. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and land this, assuming that we have consensus that we can. Okay, super cool.
Hey, Miles, did I hear that you took the DCO out of it?
I did just take the DCO out of it.
Okay, I just want to make sure I got the notes right. Okay.
Okay, cool. So the next agenda item that we have for today is how often and when do we meet? This is issue number 21. This is also a 5-minute agenda item, and I'm starting the timer. Some background on this: we've had alternating meetings right now. We've had meetings right now at 2 p.m. Eastern time. The proposal was to create alternating meetings between 2 p.m. Eastern time and 9 a.m. Eastern time. James Snell had suggested that we make a spreadsheet to check availability of individuals. He had suggested this 11 days ago, and it was also mentioned at the last meeting. And the link was shared. Since that time, 5 people have filled out their availability. So, we do not have a real granularity of information to draw from. The time of 2 p.m. was originally picked because this was the time that the board, the subcommittee of the board was meeting previously. So that time was kind of already earmarked on people's calendars. And the 9 a.m. ET time was to allow for people in Europe and other time zones to have more flexibility. I do know, for what it's worth, that there was a request that I received that the 2 p.m. meeting time is actually not convenient for everyone. But I think that, we had originally decided we would maybe move forward with the 2 p.m. and 9 a.m. times and see how that worked. Does anyone have any suggestions for alternative times, any objection to the alternating times that we've proposed? Or should we move forward with the 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. time and iterate from there?
One clarifying, sorry, I didn't raise my hand. One clarifying thing, if the 9 p.m. one could be next week, that would resolve the conflict with the ComCom individual membership thing.
The 9 a.m. meeting is next week, and it's already on the schedule that way.
Perfect.
I guess the one other thing I could add, but maybe we can close this issue and open another issue to change it, would be changing the 2 p.m. time to perhaps 1 p.m. or something like that. But I would like to suggest that perhaps we close the issue with agreement on this right now and open up a new pull request, a new issue specifically about changing the 2 p.m. time. Because I don't feel like we have enough people on the call at the moment to really make that decision. Thoughts on that?
Hey, Miles, I haven't introduced him yet, but Brian Warner is joining the Linux Foundation part-time. He was most recently at Samsung. He's finishing up law school. He's not going to be long-term on the project, but at least until we get to a merger, I'm going to have him spending a significant chunk of his time helping us move things through. The one challenge I have is he does have a law class at 2 p.m. Eastern time, so he won't be able to join any of these meetings. I can catch up with him afterwards if we need to, but if we could even just move it up to 1 p.m., it would be a possibility for him to make it too. So if that is an option, it would really help on our end to stay coordinated, but we'll make it work either way.
Thanks for the context, Mike. Can I suggest then, as a course of action, since we already have agreement that we'll meet next week at 9, let's open an issue about changing the 2 p.m. time to 1 p.m. time and give people time to chime in between now and next week. And then we could discuss it at 9 a.m., which is a time he can make.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. So that is that for that agenda item. I will update that issue as well. The next one that we have is the draft staging process. That's issue number 23. We have a 10-minute time box for this one, which I'm starting right now. The draft process as we have it right now was put together by Jory. It's had some responses in it about things that could be slightly different. The text as it exists right now has 4 different stages: stage 0, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Stage 0 is an initial proposal. Proposals in this stage are summarized in a markdown file. They have a short name and an identified champion. At least one person will be pushing the proposal through to its conclusion. They have a rough description of the program idea or policy, what resources would be needed to execute it, what committee or role is responsible for overseeing it, ideas for metrics, execution, and so forth. They have clear language about which group or groups the program policy will serve. The purpose of this stage is to capture the spirit of the idea the community may want to explore further and begin thinking about implementation ideas or process questions. One thing to point out about stage 0 is it doesn't have any sort of commitment to us actually moving forward with it. It's more an additional, it's a stage to kind of identify things. Stage 1 is a draft proposals. Proposals in this stage are written up in a style or formal policy or program language, include examples of the program idea or policy in action with clear steps and guidance. They include the steps that will need to be taken to initially implement the idea or policy. The purpose of the stage is to refine the policy, make sure all stakeholders, including the board, have had a chance to review and request changes, and determine whether further iteration is needed. So when things are in stage 1 is when it is something that we're going to be moving. It's something we want to do. So stage 0 is an idea that's being explored. Stage 1 is something that we want to do, and it's still being iterated. Stage 2 is an accepted proposal. Proposals in this stage are nearly complete. They may be in a pilot or trial run with a limited audience or pending legal review. They may be awaiting budget approval. The purpose of this stage is to complete any operational checks, such as acquiring budget, access, and board approval. So the idea is that when something moves to stage 1 to stage 2, it's pretty much locked and ready to go. And stage 2 is any formal process within the foundation that would need to happen. And then the final stage 3 are proposals that have been accepted. So once they're done, proposals that are complete. So they've been accepted, the language is locked, the budget is approved, the process is approved, and it's happening. This kind of mirrors the difference between stage 3 and stage 4 in the TC39 language process. Stage 3 is in TC39, where language features are beginning to be implemented. And stage 4 is when it's shipped. James did suggest a simpler process with only 2 stages. One is an initial proposal. One is stage 1 is the committee is reviewing the proposal, and stage 2 is that the proposal is incorporated into the feedback provided by the committee. I think the biggest difference between what James suggested and what's currently going on is that the stage that's missing in James's proposal is a stage where we've kind of agreed and have consensus on a proposal moving forward, but it hasn't actually gone through all the steps of getting approval from the board or budget or, like any sort of legal due diligence. So for that reason, I actually think that it's important to maintain that stage 2 that we currently have. I don't think that this is quite ready to land yet, but I would hope that in the next week before the next meeting, we can get this moved to a place. I have a commit that I've presented in there that does a bit of refactoring. It includes, it puts the proposals into its own directory. It includes a README where proposals can be put. It includes a template that people can use for starting their proposals. And it also just changes the language a little bit for stage 3. So, now having the context, does anyone have any thoughts or opinions about this proposal? Any concerns? I leave it to the room to discuss.
My only comment is that, like, in your proposal, there'd be an index of the proposals, right?
Yes.
And would it just make sense to use directories so that you wouldn't have to update the index as well?
We could do that as well. I think the granularity that the main index gives us is just a list of all proposals, the history of them, where they're going, what stages they're in. And while you can't see that in a directory, I think it's much easier for someone who's not part of the project to look at a folder and look at a file and know what's going on.
I guess also you might lose history if you rename.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm fine.
And we can always do both.
You might avoid extra maintenance, but yeah, I have no objections. So
Manil, were you trying to say something?
I was saying, can someone promote Rich?
I'm trying to promote Rich, and it's not working.
I just saw that.
Manil, I'm going to make you a co-host. Can you try to promote Rich?
Okay, got it.
Thank you very much. Is there any other comments or thoughts on?
I think I was able to just promote him.
Okay, great.
He's muted though automatically.
Hi.
Hi, Rich. Seems as though we have a quiet room. which is, I guess a good thing. No one seems to be outwardly objecting. One thing that could be useful to have some discussion around, does anyone have a preference between the proposed text or James' alternative of less steps?
I'm okay with all 4 steps. We can always tweak it out, right? Like,
yeah, I'm okay with having the check-in with basically the validation of yes, this can actually happen is what that second stage seems to be. I'm fine with that. I would prefer that, actually. I'm not fine with that. I'd prefer that.
Okay. I'll take an action item to follow up with Jory and to get that PR into a place where we can just have one last round of consensus at the next meeting next week, and we could likely move forward with it.
So if I'm reading this right, Miles, when would stage 4 actually come into fruition?
The final stage, which I think is stage 3, because it starts at stage 0. So stage two would be when our Bootstrap team has completed everything having to do with it and have agreement on it. That is exactly how we want to do it. And it wouldn't graduate to stage 3 until we have all the approvals and budget necessary from the foundation's board to implement it.
I'm just not sure that's. I'm sorry, I'm in the new one now, stage 3.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure that's going to be something the Bootstrap committee is really for. Like, really what this is providing the inputs to the legal drafters who are going to be working with, charged with building the legal documents, like Steve Ayers on here, and then taking that to the boards to adopt it and get to a merge agreement. So I'm not sure that ever really comes to fruition here before the merger would happen. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think that there's kind of 2 different things going on here at the same time. I think the idea would be that we want to create a process for proposals for initiatives and things at the foundation that can live out, like past the Bootstrap committee. Like this would be something that we could use within the foundation. It would be something the CPC or the C3 could adopt for all future programs and budget requests and things like that.
and this also has to do with like how we would put through governance. So not the bylaws themselves, but the governance for the CPC and whatever the top level committees we decide are going to be in place. So it's not necessarily things only for things that the board would have in their scope.
I think also for what it's worth, you could potentially graduate multiple stages in one meeting if it's in a place where it makes sense. But perhaps, Mike, that's something that we should flesh out between now and when we actually land it, and maybe be explicit about like, hey, is this just for the Bootstrap committee, or is this something like long-term for the project?
Yeah, I think what I'm taking away from the conversation here is you guys are looking at this long-term, which I'm fine with. I'm just noting that, we may never get to stage 4 until, after the merger is done, technically from a timing perspective. So.
Yeah, and I think
stage 3, sorry.
That's reasonable. And like for what it's worth, as like a comparison, like between stage 3 and stage 4 in the language, things are shipping in production before they hit stage 4. So like we could have
exactly
before it's like actually in that approved phase and be running it as a pilot.
And for now, the most important thing is just the initial stages, so we can start to land things and PR them and collaborate, as opposed to having to just comment on issues.
I got it. Sorry, take up time. Thanks.
Oh, I mean, it's important. This is good context, and we haven't run up our time box until 17 seconds from now. So I think we have some good action items on that, specifically to follow up and get the language cleaned up and try to land this next week. Okay, so the next thing that we have on here is, do we want board representation? This is also a 10-minute time box that I will kick off right now. This is an issue that was opened by Mateo as part of a conversation between Mateo and Sam Ruby and James Snell. Some questions from Ruby's that were highlighted by Mateo, do we only want Node.js to have board representation? Do we want each and every project, no matter how big or small, to have board representation? Do we want to have a single person to represent all projects? As just kind of different modes and how to think about this. If none of the above, what exactly do we want? This was followed up by a comment from James. He did a bit of a survey from project leaders in the Node.js project, where 69% of people said that the Node.js project must have representation on the foundation board. It is worth pointing out that the way in which the question was phrased there was not super clear. So what that means and how that actually happens in practice is not extremely clear. The conversation has continued to go on quite a bit in there, but like I think the high level takeaway that I have at least is that we want to maintain community representation, and we were also trying to tease out exactly what is the reason why the projects so explicitly want board representation. And I think one of the primary reasons was about things that we could be blocked on by the board, such as budget or legal. I'm going to leave it to the room now that I've set some context. We have about 8.5 minutes left for this discussion. Does anyone have particular thoughts around board representation? And I would see it in like the difference between community representation versus project representation versus like governance representation and ways in which people see this would work.
So one quick comment is everybody in every group I've been in always seems to want to have board representation. And then when they see what happens in boards and are bored and see all the unanimous votes that happen, they are less than excited about being board reps. So that said, because it really is that boring. Well, it can be. In various projects, we've come up with different ways of handling this, right? In an organization like we're creating, we have a parallel in the CNCF, and their take on this was that board representation was important, that we should reserve maybe a couple of seats, and that the largest project, by default, because people in it could vote for one of their members to be on the board every time, should therefore vote to get one seat, and that the balance of the projects could then vote for another seat to accompany that person on the board. That gave representation to both all the other little projects, and then the biggest one, whose largest membership would always vote for their project anyway to be a rep, also just we recognized that and just gave them a seat, which had to be voted in anyway. So, something like several seats like that sort of, appeased the membership, and it seemed to work fairly, and it's been in practice now for a bit. But I think what's more important is that the people who are in those seats are deeply ingrained in the process and the projects, and that there's a way of making sure that those people fit some kind of profile in terms of what they're doing and how they're contributing. And that was something that the CNCF then went and worked out who was eligible to be nominated and voted into those seats. And it yielded people who were very dedicated and high quality too. So some process around that would be preferable from my standpoint as well.
Thank you, Todd. Tierney, you have your hand up, and then I can't put my hand up because I'm on the meeting, but just this is me putting my hand up for after. Tierney?
Yeah, so to quickly respond to Todd, the community committee is a group that went from not having representation to having representation after asking for it and working for it. And I would say that, like, from my own point of view, I would in our current state of things, I would not want to go back to not having it because it's boring or because we're not doing anything. Where it's actually a useful thing to have to make sure that the community committee in the Node Foundation, at least, is represented, and we can, when things that apply to the community committee come up, we can actually help be there at the consensus building time before the vote comes up, when it's a unanimous vote, that we can actually be there and kind of help push that along. Additionally, I would like to say that from how I understand it, board representation really depends on how the foundation is actually going to be structured. Even in Todd's example of CNCF, Kubernetes is like, I guess now one of two, unless there's been a third added, but one of two of the top tier projects in CNCF. I'm not sure if CNCF just gives a seat to any top tier project automatically.
No.
Okay, cool. But to my point, I think that the representation and how that surfaces really does depend on structure and how we structure the foundation. And like talking about how many seats we're going to have or anything like that is a little bit premature if we don't understand how the foundation is structured, in my opinion.
Excellent. Tierney, is that everything?
Yep.
Okay, cool. It sounded like maybe you dropped or something. So a couple notes that I was just thinking about, and Tierney, you actually touched on one of them, which is really great, is that, the representation really, it matters to some extent, but I think one of the things a lot of us want to do is like have a seat at the table where the work is happening. And I think, you bring up the ComCom seat. I think one of the really great examples was the Joint Strategy Subcommittee is actually where 90% of the work of getting there actually happened at that Joint Strategy Subcommittee. And by the time we brought it to the board, we had done so much work that it just passed unanimously in a matter of about a minute and a half. There wasn't even a conversation about it. So I think with that in mind, you were very on the money that, there's kind of two different things that we're solving for here. One is community representation at the board, which is important, and the other is having a seat at the table where the work's happening. And I think the structure that we'll design will kind of help that happen. I think that one of the things we do need to be focused on right now is specifically where community representation and the bylaws intersect. So in this first pass where we're putting together the initial bylaws, making sure that there is room for this kind of representation in the bylaws and that we have that figured out. So one of the things that we have right now was the number of seats that we have. Right now we have 3 of 12 seats, which is about a quarter. And it sounded like, Todd, you were talking earlier today that it's about a quarter of the CNCF boards that is community reps as well. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so about a quarter, and the same for OpenStack, about a quarter.
Do you think that it would be reasonable for our bylaws to potentially have language that effectively states that a certain percentage of the board would be reserved for community seats?
Yeah, each one has a different way of going about doing that.
Mm-hmm.
We do need to adopt some language and keep it probably to some ratio.
Yep.
In the OpenStack case, it was all ratioed off of how many platinum seats were filled. So if there were 6 platinum seats, there would be 6 gold seats, and then there would be 6 community seats as an example, right? Or if there was only 4, then it would be 444, right? So it was ratioed to grow as the organization grew and the folks supporting it grew, and never to get to a point where it was out of balance.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Todd. And I think that also for that kind of initial thing that we were trying to work out, which is one of the next items, what we're asking for the board, perhaps that's a really clear ask of how we can frame it. One thing that I'll just put out there for us to come to later, we don't need to dig in, the Joint Strategy Subcommittee had come up with a proposal for board seats that would have made them just general community seats that on a yearly basis would be allocated and ratified so that they weren't specific to specific committees. And by doing that, it allowed us to be more flexible based on where the work in the project was happening and making sure that the people who needed to be at the board could be there. So that's something that we could explore as an implementation detail later, especially if we make it flexible in the bylaws themselves. Manil, you have your hand up?
Hey, so as we approach this problem, I remember we had a very extended conversation about the way we would structure board representation at the Collab Summit, and doing this async is probably not going to make it very much easier. I think part of this is we should start by also eliminating the kinds of board structures or representation we won't want to use, so that from both sides we narrow it down to something that we actually want to carry out, because we have extensive examples from people's experience here of what they found works and doesn't work, and we want to leverage all of that. That's it.
Cool. Thank you, Manil. We've actually gone over time here, so I think we should move on. We have that issue where people can chime in, but I think we're getting some, good ideas of where this can go. So I don't think there's any explicit action items for that one for right now. So the next thing that we have here is number 6, which is create expectations for foundation draft. This is a PR opened by Tracy. We have 10 minutes on the clock for it. And we're actually running a little bit ahead of time, but I don't think anyone's going to complain about that. With the intent, this is Tracy's issue with the intent to merge the Node.js and JS Foundation being announced. Those interested in continued support of Node.js and JS-related projects are working through expectations and structure for what the potential new foundation could look like. This document is for the initial phase of work for the Bootstrap team to draft requirements that overlap with scope of the board in order to provide an outline and structure for the foundation attuned to the needs of the project and ecosystem stakeholders who have participated. The TLDR on this is that this list right now is supposed to be our ask to the board essentially for the things that we want covered by the bylaws, but it's also a very high level thing that we have consensus on things that we want our foundation to do. So not all of these are explicitly going to be addressed by the bylaws, but our bylaws should allow for all of the things in this list. And so the current list is communicated scope for the foundation and board, annual reviews of staff, NPS, board programs, support services to projects for accountability and incremental improvement. The foundation staff, executive director, and board should follow a servant leadership style. I've asked for maybe a better way to phrase that one in particular right now. Project representation on the board, and there's a list of potential different ways of doing this. It says projects could have tiers or community representation on the board, one seat guaranteed for a cross-project council, or each council, CPC, and community should have a given allotted amount of board seats. So I think that this bit of the doc can maybe be fleshed out to be a little bit more broad. The next item they have here is that the board must establish a cross-project council focused on the specific needs of the member projects, allowing projects to self-organize amongst themselves. Processes are defined and driven by the project. CPC is not a structure of the board, and the CPC should be co-chaired by the executive director of the foundation. Non-corporate member representation in budget and finance subcommittee. Project should drive foundation focus and priority. No pay-to-play and technical participation. Earmarking allowed with flexibility and budget for concerns and needs of individual projects. Value satisfaction with regular feedback from projects. And I've also added 2 things that I'd like to see added to this, which is the ability for budgetary decisions to be delegated, as well as the ability for projects to leave the foundation. Do people have any thoughts about the scope of this document? If this document as it's phrased right now is really effective? To Mike and Todd in particular, as people who would kind of be receiving this as guidelines for some of the bylaws, did you find that language to be particularly actionable, or is it maybe heading in the wrong direction? So I'll kind of leave it to the room and to kind of, see some questions here. The ones I gave to Mike and Todd are good, but also on the other side to the collaborators who are here, are there any concerns that you have with how it was framed or anything you think is missing? Michael has his hand up physically.
The one that calls out to me that would actually be maybe a departure from what we've seen is that the co-chairing of the CPC. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where that came from or the motivation behind that, but that's one thing that sort of stands out in so far we have, the technical, it depends whether you consider that as sort of a technical thing mm-hmm. versus a board thing, right?
Yeah, it could also be arguably out of scope.
Right yeah, now. And it does seem a little like it's a little bit different than many of the other asks. So that's one that maybe just be taken out.
We normally would not specify that, so I don't know where that came from, but
yeah, I agree with Mike.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I can see value in that, but I don't and if it's not specified, I don't think there's much of an opportunity for it to happen. Does that seem to resonate with anyone else?
I agree.
And if we don't actually list this out, there's not necessarily. I think what the intent here is to require the ED to this is the ED, right? Yeah, the ED to engage with the CPC at a consistent level. And so I think that having that accountability is good. So I guess maybe instead of that specific way, ensuring that the ED is highly engaged with the CPC in some way. And I don't know what that is, but I think this is more of a specific example rather than a general statement of desire.
So with my hand up, would it maybe be a good reframing to just say that we would like the executive director to be able to attend the CPC and participate? But either way, I do think this is still premature because this is about CPC governance. This isn't bylaw related. And in fact, maybe even a step further is even mentioning the CPC premature here.
Quite possibly. I think the other thing I'd add is I'm not sure we'd have consensus because from past experience in terms of, there were some people we said, hey, let's invite the ED to the TSC meetings. And there's actually a fair amount of pushback on that. So I don't know that I'd feel comfortable with us saying that's an ask from the project yet.
Yeah, and it may not be the ED that comes. We may have somebody who turns out to be the COO, I'll call him, of the project that maybe needs to interact with the TSC or ComCom or others in order to be able to get them the resources that they need. And so specifying something like that, this doesn't really make a lot of sense in this. Those are things that you want to sort of fluidly add afterwards. Otherwise, you'll get, sort of boxed in by the bylaws.
And Mike Dolan mentioned in the comments, usually you'd handle this through job responsibilities and objectives for an ED, and also CPC meetings are open to anyone to attend usually. So that's some interesting context from other CPCs that we definitely should be looking into. And I think maybe we just have consensus that a lot of this stuff that has to do with project governance is early. Tierney, you have your hand up?
Yeah, after you're done talking about this specific point.
I'm done.
Okay. Additionally, I didn't see anything about trademark and brand usage. I want to be sure that projects retain the ability to use their trademarks and brand when joining or existing ones that are already in the projects respectively. Node is a special case in that we don't own our own trademark, but ensuring that other projects do is something that I would like to see before commenting on this. Does anyone object to that?
So Mike should answer that. He's the lawyer that we have on the phone.
So normally, Node being an asterisk in all of the projects we host, normally the foundations own the trademarks, and then the community or the governing board approves a policy around trademark usage that would allow anybody to use the mark under whatever conditions or whatever structure they agree to. And so that usually applies to all trademarks. If you want to do it different from that, we can discuss it, but it does get challenging with trademarks because they are a intellectual property provision that works with identification of source. And so it's hard to do source identification when the source is, many different people in a community context. But usually if somebody's using the trademark, it's, hey, I'm a member of this, or hey, we're a contributor of this, or, something along those lines. When you start getting into, I'm a certified, trademark administrator, or I have a certified trademark solution. That's usually when, more discussion is usually relevant around what does it mean to be able to use that mark. And that's usually where the community process of coming together and identifying here's what the minimum requirements are to say that you're, say, using a certified node.js implementation or something like that are. So usually, all that falls back on owning the rights to the trademark. And the other challenge is you don't want to set up a structure where somebody could unilaterally yank a trademark out after the foundation built up a bunch of goodwill around it. And so, if it's becoming something that the community feels like it is owning of, then, you can't have one person be able to unilaterally take the trademark back once it builds a lot of value in the community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Because this is like a values document, something that it's things that we want to see. I added a comment that effectively tried to summarize that, kind of what you said, to make sure that that's a value that we expect.
Tierney, just some clarifying questions for you. So when we're talking about using the trademark and branding and stuff, is this specifically about like being able to use the brand to do things, or is this more along the lines of like how the brand is being used? And to be a little bit more explicit, like, are you talking about like wanting to have access to the Twitter account of the project rather than it being owned by marketing? Or are you talking about like wanting to kind of run and do programs with the trademark, or is it both?
So more of the first thing you said, and you said two sets of things. So actually being able to use the trademark. So whether it's the trademarked icon, the trademark name, having the project contributors and even the broader community being able to use that. Like for example, William was creating Node.js hats. Obviously, Node.js is the asterisk, but you know, being able to do that with another project in the foundation, and not being being able to go and use that trademark to do something as a community member to support the community. That's an example of what I'm trying to get at.
So is satisfied by like having clear programs and ways to utilize the trademark for initiatives?
Yes.
Mike, sorry for interrupting. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that actually is easier in the non-Node.js world because Node.js is a little bit different in terms of the ownership structure right now. If you did have Project B and Project B, you wanted to go create stickers and logos and stuff like that, it's a much simpler situation to be in from our perspective usually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was using the Node.js hat as an example because that's something like that I know happened. And like that's an example, but like with Project B instead of Node.js on the hat as an example.
Yeah, it's a lot easier in the non-licensed trademark situation. Unfortunately, all you've seen probably out of this is the Node.js situation, which is not the ideal.
Yeah.
Okay. We have run overtime on this agenda item. We've got one more item left on our agenda for today, which is number 7, a first pass at a Bootstrap process. I'm going to keep us to a 10-minute time box, and maybe we can end a little early on this. This is a big issue. It was opened by Adam. It ended up having a lot of stuff in it, and it looks like since the last time I kind of picked it apart, it maybe has not been dealt with. So we may even want to just end the meeting early and not digging in. But just to give an update to the people who haven't taken a look at this, this was kind of a first strap of bootstrapping a whole bunch of different things. And as such, it actually has a few things we've already talked about today. It includes within it an updated README with a whole bunch of information. It has a cross-community council and cross-project council documented in there. I've actually requested that we drop that from this PR and move that through the staging process instead. It has a document about the foundation itself, which has like historical information about how the foundation was started and some definitions of like particular values that we have, such as community focused, project driven, transparent operation, simple structure. And a place for top level committees and representations, and some expectations, but the expectations that they have here is very similar to the things that we were doing in Tracy's pull request. So I requested that those be removed. It has a README that outlines some basic definitions and things in there. Some of these may need to be removed, as like it does mention stuff like the CPC and the C3. It also has a list of deliverables that we would like to put together, which I think are pretty good. And then I had a whole bunch of stuff related to operations and governance, which I've requested be removed and moved to issue 19, which was the governance issue that we talked about earlier. It also had kind of like an initial bit at like a template for proposing new programs, as well as a README that's outlining it. I've requested that be removed and moved to issue 23, which is the draft staging proposal that we talked about earlier. And so, you know, like really when the bits that overlap with other initiatives that have been having kind of more collaboration in them aside from this issue get removed. It's mostly kind of an update to the README and some base definitions that we agreed as shared definitions. If anyone has any questions or thoughts on it, we could dig in. But my intuition right now, because it hasn't been iterated since the last set of issues, is that it may not be the most effective use of time. And I just, if anyone has specific questions or comments, we should dig into that. But otherwise, we may actually just want to wrap up early.
Yeah, the agreement was last time that he was going to remove those pieces, the overlap, and we'd go from there. So since that hasn't happened, I'd have to agree.
Yeah. Does anyone have any thoughts or anything right now? Okay, cool. So I think we can just wrap up that issue for right now. We do have 10 minutes left on the agenda. We can end early, or is there anyone on the call who has anything else that they'd like to bring up, or thoughts or concerns, or just, celebrations? Doesn't need to be negative. Anything at all? Okay, cool. With that, I think it's safe to say that the meeting is adjourned. I'm going to go.
Miles, I think I have one question if I can raise my hand right before everybody breaks. Sorry to chime in at the last minute, but last time we had talked through, or we had at least shown sort of the governance structure. Are we still basically working off of this slide 3 box version that you had come up with the CPC, the projects, incubator, and all of that? Is that
node.js?
Yeah.
At a concept level, is everybody working off of this as their mental, I guess, concept of what we're doing?
Next thing we have to solidify, right? Like,
yeah.
I don't think it's been discussed since then, but I think that's the key thing that we do need to get locked down.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when you're all jumping into like board representation and things like that, I think it assumes some version of this, and I wanted to make sure I understood what version of this we're actually.
Yeah, I think that chart needs a slight update. I think the last place that we left it was across community council instead of a community committee. So that's the C3. And I think it's missing a box between the incubator and the commons.js that would be for a sandbox. So like room for projects that don't necessarily want to go through the graduated process. And I guess maybe you could put commons.js below an incubator and sandbox next to it. Like, I don't know, but we don't need to go through a design review right now. And I guess this would be council and C3.
I think from a drafting perspective, this is probably the most important thing, just to lock down conceptually what this looks like, and then we can figure out the board representation details. But from a bylaws perspective, there probably won't be much more detail than just what's here. What we then work on is charters for each of these. So I just want to give you a sort of an expectation of what I think Steve and Andy and I will need to have in order to start taking this forward. That makes sense?
I'm just capturing in here the slight difference for the CPC that we were discussing. But aside from that, like, yeah, I don't think that we've had major pushback on that proposed structure.
But I don't know
but we want
to enough discussion on it.
Exactly.
I think we need to say, this is where we're starting. Let's have the discussion, maybe even have a whole meeting where that's the focus.
Mm-hmm. But it may be enough for you to run and start figuring out some of the bylaws that would allow a structure like that, because I don't think we'd be too wildly different.
If I might propose on the agenda for next week, maybe starting off with this and just trying to lock this down as stage 0 or stage 1 or whatever. But
like give it a good like half the meeting or some reasonable portion of the time.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, especially since we've kind of fleshed out much of the process, and maybe we can work on. Mike, would you have time to work on a stage 0 proposal based on like the current state of that proposed staging system for that structure that we're working on, so we can maybe discuss it and like have an issue that we can use to track discussion before the meeting?
Yeah, I can try to get that ready for next week. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then just let me know if you need any support on it.
It's just going to be generic. I'm not going to know, all the nuances of issues and things that people are worried about. So it's going to be a generic view, and then, just don't shoot at it. Just propose improvements.
Absolutely.
If you open an issue, we'll all just comment in constructively.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. So 7 minutes early. I'm going to call this meeting. If there's no objections, I adjourn the meeting. I'm going to go ahead and stop the live stream.